I want to begin today by going through the second passion and resurrection prediction according to the Gospel of Mark. The first one we saw was in chapter 8, verse 31. More details were given there than are given here. And immediately after the passion and resurrection prediction, there was a misunderstanding of it. It seemed on the surface level by Peter, but it could include the other 11 as well. Because there was that misunderstanding, Jesus has got to correct it by teaching them on discipleship, and then he gives them the reinforcement. The reinforcement which is given by Jesus in two ways, namely by the transfiguration and then by curing the boy who was with epilepsy when the disciples could not cure the boy. In chapter 9, verse 30, notice the reason why Jesus does not want anyone to know it is because now the disciples are the focus. The disciples so far have not been able to understand the kind of Messiah that Jesus is, even though Peter seemed to have answered at least correctly on the very, very normal level, you are the Christ. Because it is not specified the kind of Christ that Jesus is, now Jesus wants to teach his disciples. And he is teaching his disciples once again, very, very briefly here, unlike in the first, where the chief priests, elders, and scribes were mentioned. Here, it is only human hands. However, what is important is the verb paradidomi. This verb paradidomi, sometimes translated as gave, sometimes handed over, is also translated as betrayed, depending on the context in which the verb is used. So will the translation be in English. However, it is a passive verb. That means Jesus will be given into human hands. In John chapter 3, verse 16, the same verb is used by John when he says, "For God so loved the world that he paradidomi, that he gave." So there, it's not betrayed his son, there, giving. This giving is a free giving there, but paradidomi here, in which Jesus uses paradidomi, is betrayed into human hands. And the reason why it is translated as betrayed is because of what happens later, namely that they will kill him. So unlike the mocking, the scourging, which are all mentioned in the third, unlike the chief priests and the elders and the scribes, which are mentioned in the first, here this is the briefest of the three passion and resurrection predictions. However, here too, like in the earlier one, the active verb is used, he will rise again. Unlike Matthew and Luke, who specify he will be raised, here the active verb, and the active verb specifies the faith of Jesus, the confidence of Jesus, the trust of Jesus in God. So the use of the active verb is Jesus is certain. Jesus is sure. He has not an iota of doubt, and that is why he can talk about himself in the active verb sense. He will rise again. Now, even though Mark has said here, they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him, reading a little into the text, we can say that they actually did not want to understand. And the reason why they did not want to understand was because if Jesus explained to them, if he explicated, which he already did earlier on in chapter 8, verses 34 to chapter 9, verse 1, if he did, then they would be forced to try to understand. So it seems that deliberately they do not want to understand. Now, this deliberate not wanting to understand also becomes clear when very clearly they know what they have to argue about, they know what they have to discuss about. And so when they come to Capernaum, once again in the house is a place both of teaching, is a place where the disciples ask Jesus questions, but is also a place of privacy. So in Capernaum and in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about? Only in Mark, on the way. And we saw, even though on the surface level, it might seem like Jesus is only asking them about what they were discussing on the road, it seems on the deeper level, I am talking about one way and you are talking about another way. So what were you discussing about on the way? And very strangely, you can see what I said earlier, namely that they did not want to understand because they would have heard about the death of Jesus. They would have heard about his rising again. And even if they didn't understand it deep in their hearts, they at least knew what matters were concerning them and what they needed to discuss. And they also know through their silence that they cannot really answer. This is Mark's intervention now. They had argued with one another who was greatest. We do not hear the argument. We only know that Jesus has heard them and asked them the question. But their silence is given detailed instruction or given detailed interpretation by Mark when he tells us they had argued with one another who was the greatest. So while they're not able to understand the passion and resurrection prediction, they can understand very clearly that there will be positions, and that's what they are arguing about. The sitting down is once again the posture of a rabbi. The sitting down is also an indication that Jesus is now going to teach them something. And while we have heard this so often that really it makes very little, if any, sense to us, this, I think, is the core of what we must keep in mind who want to be deacons first and then priests. Unfortunately, this is forgotten almost soon after the ordination. Diakone means to serve. And the reason why those who want to be ordained priests are first ordained deacons is to remind them that they are the servants of the people, that they are being ordained to serve. Unfortunately, all too often, the child whom Jesus puts is forgotten. The fact that we should be those with non-entity, that is the meaning of a child. So a child in the time of Jesus was a non-entity, was someone who was not regarded. Unfortunately, like women, the child not only did not have to be heard, but did not even have to be seen. This is what Jesus means by a child. And while other qualities like innocence, like spontaneity, like lovableness are all part of the child's qualities, what Jesus is focusing on most here is that the child is dependent. So dependence is the prime quality. A child cannot manage on its own. A child has to always, every time, ask for help. For something like basic food, for something like basic drink, for something like basic sustenance, the child has to ask. And that is why the prayer which Jesus teaches in Matthew and Luke, and even the prayer which we will see later on in Mark, when we are given the content of the prayer of Jesus, are all petitionary prayers. That means, God, I am dependent. A petitionary prayer is a sign of dependence. When I have to ask, when I have to beg, if you like, when I have to plead, they are a sign of dependence. And that is what Jesus means when he brings a child. That just as this child is dependent, so must you be if you want to be a disciple of the kingdom. And this is important for us to keep in mind as we study and as we prepare ourselves first for the diaconate and then for the priesthood. It is likely that many of us want to be priests because we have seen the authority which the priests have. We have seen the number of resources which are at the priest's disposal. We have seen the regard with which people look at priests. We have seen how comfortable, how luxurious even their lives are. And we say to ourselves, we have one life. Let us also live this life in luxury. Why should we struggle like the so many millions? If we forget that the call is primarily, I would say even only, to keep serving and to keep acknowledging our dependence, it is better for us to rethink our call. So then we see that there is John, one of the 12, as we saw. He saw someone casting out demons in the name of Jesus. So we notice that in chapter 9, verses 14 to 29, even though John was not there because he was on the mountain of transfiguration with Jesus, the disciples who were down, the other 9, were unable to cast that demon out. And now there is someone using the name of Jesus. So we can see very, very strongly, John is still being parochial. John is being narrow-minded. Why does John want to stop the man? Not because he was doing something bad, but because he was not following us. Notice us. Who's the us? So John is already forgetting that he himself is a follower. So now already he puts himself in the position of a leader. So how can he use the plural pronoun us when he should actually say he was not following you? Even that would be bad enough. There is a background. Joshua wanting to stop Eldad and Medad, who were using the name of Moses. And Moses says, no, do not stop him. Here, Jesus responds in the same manner. And very beautifully, even though Luke also has this, Luke also has another more challenging statement. Luke has both. Luke has this, whoever is not against us is for us. And in Luke also another statement they use, whoever is not for us is against us. That is a challenging statement. However, we don't discuss that at the moment. Now, we can see in Mark the inclusiveness which Jesus asks for. You can look at the two statements in Luke 11:23 and 9:50. In 11:23 and Matthew 12:30, it is whoever is not against us is for us. But in Luke 9:50, whoever is not for us is against us. However, here, Jesus will not have someone stopped just because he's not a follower. And here we notice Jesus responds in action to the parables that he told and also to the detachment from mission. So it is not a force, it is not a coercion. In the context of John possibly trying to be a stumbling block, a hurdle, a scandal. Notice the word stumbling block is the Greek skandalos. The translation can be scandal, but often it's translated stumbling block. And the ones who cause a scandal are ones who cause others to stumble. That's why it's called a stumbling block. So if any of you is a scandal before one of these little ones who believe in me, notice in Matthew's community discourse, which is in Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 to 35, Matthew has in it the parable of the lost sheep. And in the parable of the lost sheep, Matthew speaks about the lost sheep as the little ones in the community, because the ending of Matthew's lost sheep parable is, it is not the will of my Father that one of these little ones should be lost. Luke chapter 15 is quite a different ending. There is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 who had no need of repentance. So the lost sheep is a sinner in Luke. In Matthew, the little one, that is those in the community who are weak. And this weakness can be of a variety of types. It can be weak financially and economically. It can be weak spiritually. It can be weak psychologically. It can be weak physically. It can be weak in a variety of ways. Because Christianity is not merely an individual religion, but Christianity is both individual and communitarian. What I do affects my brother or sister. Very, very strong, even hyperbolic language is used to show what will happen to the one who causes scandal. The hand and the eye and the feet and other parts of the body are mentioned to say no part should cause scandal. In other words, the entire person should be able to edify. If a person causes scandal, that person cannot really profess to be a disciple of Jesus. The worm never dies indicates basically the continual punishment, and everyone will be salted with fire. Every believer will be tested, and your test will be, how do you come across? Are you edifying others or are you scandalizing others? If you have to edify others, you have to have salt in yourself. In chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew, verses 13 to 16, Jesus uses two metaphors. And the metaphors there are, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Jesus does not say, you are like salt. No. He does not say, you are like light. That would be a simile. But I say it's a metaphor because Jesus identifies the disciple with salt and the disciple with light when he says, you are the salt, you are the light. Now, sometimes that has been interpreted to mean the qualities of salt, the function of salt, like the saltiness for it. No. How is salt used? Salt is used in sacrifice. Salt is used to preserve. Salt is used in the cooking. Salt is used to make something salty. Salt is used to add taste. Those are the functions of salt. When Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, he's not talking of the functions. That will happen only if the salt is salty. So what Jesus is talking about there is the intrinsic quality of salt and the intrinsic quality of light. What is the intrinsic quality of salt? Saltiness. And so, if salt is not salty, what is the use? You cannot use it in food. There will be no taste. You cannot use it to preserve. It will not preserve. You cannot use it in sacrifice because it is not salt. So the saltiness is what determines the function. And so therefore, if the light is not light, you can bring it into a room, it will not light the room. You can put it on a lampstand, it will not light, because there is no light. So saltiness and light are the intrinsic quality in Matthew. And here Mark specifies, if salt has lost its saltiness, what is the use? You cannot season it. You cannot make it salty again because you need salt. And that's why if you as my disciple have lost that intrinsic quality of being Christ-like, then there's a danger you can become a scandal. Because communal living is extremely important. Because what is important is communal living, be at peace with one another. So saltiness in an individual would result in the person edifying others and also edification within community. Our minds go back to Mark chapter 1, verses 16 and 20, 16 to 20, where Simon and Andrew are casting their net, being edifying, drawing others through their lives. James and John are mending their net, be at peace with one another, communal living. Both these come together here also. Jesus is now on his way, and he goes to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and now he is tested once again. He is tested with the question of divorce. Romans and Greeks both had divorce, and there was no social stigma with regard to divorce. A woman was given to a man, and along with the woman was given also her dowry, her property, which was administered by the husband. If there was a divorce in Roman and Greek society, the woman would return to her parents' home along with the property. And the two main causes of divorce were adultery and infertility. Because in the Jewish cultural context, marriage was a low social and legal contract, divorce was not as common, though it was already allowed by Deuteronomy. Now, what was the point originally which Deuteronomy made? Deuteronomy 24, 1 to 4 was actually to protect the woman, to forbid a man to remarry a woman whom he had divorced if she had been married to somebody else and divorced from that person. So did not to treat the woman like an object. That is what, so the man divorced his wife. If she married somebody else and that person also divorced her, the first husband could not marry the woman. That is the original. And there are many passages in Deuteronomy which forbid divorce. So in a way, Divorce was not meant to be the regular. As a matter of fact, this is what Jesus will state. So when Jesus leaves that place, once again, when crowds gather around him, he either feeds them physically or he feeds them spiritually. So this is the response. You notice the response of Jesus is also to respond to the crowd. He teaches them. Here, he teaches them. In other cases, he both teaches and feeds them. Now notice here, the Pharisees come to test him. Peirazzo. Peirazzo was the verb which Mark used for the tempting in the desert by Satan. So the question is not asked for information. The question is asked to test him. So very clearly it shows that they want to trap him in what he says. So therefore, he answered them once again in the form of a question. What did Moses command you? Did Moses allow a divorce? Did he not allow a divorce? They say, yes, he allowed. And notice, after Moses, there were two schools. One was the school of Shammai, which said you can divorce a woman if she is not chaste. So unchastity, which Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9 also speak about. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, part of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 19:9, it's a doublet. It's called the doublet. The same verse appearing twice in the same gospel, Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:9. Both those texts speak about divorce except for zenuth. Zenuth is translated in Greek as porneia, which is translated in English as unchastity. So a person was allowed to divorce his wife according to Matthew and then according to Shammai. The school of Shammai was a very powerful rabbi. If the woman was unchaste, of course, unfortunately, women could hardly initiate divorce. The school of Hillel said a man could divorce his wife for whatever reason, even if she spoiled a dish when cooking. Even if he saw someone who was fairer or more beautiful than his wife, he could divorce his wife. Jesus, however, goes not to Deuteronomy, but goes before Deuteronomy when he first tells them that divorce was allowed as a concession. And this is what we must keep in mind, that sometimes concessions are given because if you hold a person and don't give the concession, the repercussions can be worse. However, it does not seem to me to be the case. Jesus is very clear that it was the hardness of heart, so almost as a concession, because if Moses had not allowed you, you would have divorced and created even more of a problem. And Jesus then goes back to Genesis, where God made them male and female, and same book of Genesis to say very explicitly there, a man leaves his father and mother. The first thing he does. Second, clings to his wife, joined to the wife. And the third, become one. So if they are one, they cannot really be separated because they have become one. And the three-step process, leaving the former life, joining the new life, the positive aspect, and becoming one is the third aspect. In the case of the disciples, we saw that there was a negative response. They left their former life. And the positive, they took on the vocation of discipleship. In the case of a married couple, there is basically something more, that the two become one. And that is why I have the greatest regard for married couples. For you and for me, as priests or studying to be priests, as religious, if you are a woman religious, it is quite easy. Because many of us, not all, There are some who have challenges in religious life. But many of us live as comfortable bachelors. We have everything in our rooms. We don't have to account to anyone. If we have to account, it's just for the basics, being there at mealtime or being there at prayer time or something small as that. But for a married couple, they have to account for every single moment. They are there constantly. And during these days, to be in a small place together and with the children is tremendously challenging. So divorce is a human decision. Union is God's decision. And then the disciples ask him about this matter once again in the house. Notice they are in the house. So Jesus here talks about the Roman and the Greek concept about allowing a man to divorce and even a woman divorcing. So you notice already Jesus is putting women on the level as men. That, however, he's not permitting divorce, but also talking about a woman divorcing a man, which the Pharisees do not talk about at all.